He won races, he beat Dale Earnhardt head-to-head, and he helped modernize the sport. But yet, most NASCAR fans barely hear his name today. There was no long farewell, no lasting celebration, no constant replay of his highlights. It almost feels like Tim Richmond disappeared from NASCAR's memory almost immediately. So the question isn't whether he was great. He was. The real question is, why doesn't NASCAR talk about him the way they talk about other stars and legends? Tim Richmond didn't come from the typical NASCAR pipeline. He had an open-wheel background, he drove aggressively, and he drove with confidence, sometimes even arrogance, and the fans loved it at the time. By the early 1980s, Richmond wasn't just competitive. He was exciting. He won big races, attracted attention, and brought a different energy into the NASCAR garage.
Thunder. Tom Cruise came to our shop. He said, "Tell me about Tim Richmond." I'm actually portraying Tim Richmond without saying it in the movie. You know, we can talk to you all day, but you're going to have a hard time portraying it.
He won 7 NASCAR Cup Series races and finished 3rd in the championship points. At that point, many believed he was a future title contender. But even as he succeeded, it was clear he didn't fit NASCAR's traditional image. Tim Richmond wasn't quiet. He didn't blend in. He didn't want to play the role that NASCAR was used to. He crossed into mainstream pop culture, he dated celebrities, and he showed his personality at a time when NASCAR seemed to value uniformity. Some fans loved it and others didn't. He wasn't the stereotypical redneck that most NASCAR drivers were seen as at the time. And inside the sport, there was a sense that Tim Richmond was just different. Not necessarily worse, just different than the other drivers. And sometimes these differences can make institutions uncomfortable. In 1987, everything changed. Tim Richmond failed a NASCAR physical before the Daytona 500. Then he began to miss races, and he missed most of the season. There was no clear explanation. There were a lot of rumors, such as drugs, partying, or a lack of discipline, and NASCAR at the time never clarified much publicly. He was rarely spoke about in detail. And slowly, one of the biggest stars vanished. Not a dramatic ending, but a quiet absence. That silence is important. After failing that physical and disappearing from the grid, most people assumed Tim Richmond was done. But he wasn't. In 1987, Richmond fought his way back into a car, visibly thinner and clearly not the same physically. But he still seemed competitive. And then something unexpected happened. He didn't just return, he won. Tim Richmond came back and won 2 races after missing much of the season. Not against weak fields, against the best drivers in the sport. It proves something important. This wasn't a case of a driver who partied his way out of NASCAR. This wasn't talent that had began to fade. Even while sick, even while being sidelined, Tim Richmond was still good enough to beat everyone, including the star at the time, Dale Earnhardt. And yet that comeback never became part of his lasting legacy. There was no celebration of resilience, no narrative about perseverance, no long-term framing of what he overcame. Instead, it quietly faded into the background. And this silence only makes what came next hit harder. After those wins in 1987, a lot of fans assumed Tim Richmond was back for good. But he wasn't. Even while winning, his health was deteriorating rapidly. And he wasn't just out of shape, or recovering from a cold. He was seriously ill. What the public didn't know at the time was that Tim Richmond was battling AIDS, at a point in history when the disease was still poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. That explained a lot. Why he had failed the physical, why he lost weight so quickly, why he disappeared for long stretches, and it explains why even after winning again, he couldn't sustain a full return. After those victories, Richmond attempted to continue racing, but his body simply wouldn't allow it. His final Cup Series start came later in 1987, and after that, he was done. Not by choice, but by circumstance. What's striking looking back is how little was said publicly. When Tim Richmond vanished again after his brief return, broadcasters didn't explain much. On air, the story was usually framed as Tim Richmond is at home recovering, he's dealing with complications from a previous injury, or the doctors just aren't clearing him yet. At times, broadcasts referenced him being at home or in recovery following medical complications without ever naming the real issue. There were moments where announcers spoke about him almost like he was temporarily sidelined, even as it became clear he wasn't going to be coming back. The truth stayed off the air, not because people didn't care, but because at the time, no one knew how to talk about it. By 1988, Tim Richmond was spending extended time in the hospital. He was largely out of the public eye, no interviews, no updates, no clear timeline for a return. Behind the scenes, his condition worsened. In that era, an AIDS diagnosis often meant isolation, fear from others, and limited treatment options. He wasn't just fighting an illness, he was fighting stigma. And unlike today, there was no framework for public understanding or compassion in sports. The disease itself made people uncomfortable, and that discomfort translated into distance. Tim Richmond died on August 13, 1989. He was just 34 years old.
Controversial members early Sunday morning. Tim Richmond, who was successful in both open wheel and stock car racing, lost his long battle with an undisclosed illness in West Palm Beach, Florida. Although many outside the auto racing community will dwell on rumors of drug abuse and speculate on the exact cause of his death, Richmond should first be remembered as someone who accomplished a great deal and became a very popular driver in his short stay in Major League Racing.
Only after his death did the truth finally emerge, that AIDS had taken his life. For many fans, it was shocking. For others, it suddenly made sense. The failed physical, the weight loss, the disappearances, and even the unfortunate sudden end. But by then, his career had already faded quietly into the background. But this is where things get uncomfortable, but important. In the late 1980s, NASCAR was very conservative, traditional, and deeply uncomfortable with conversations about AIDS. Richmond's story didn't fit a clean narrative. There was no heroic final lap, no graceful retirement, and no easy explanation for fans at the time. So instead of addressing it directly, the sport seemed to let the story pass without emphasis. It wasn't a conspiracy, it wasn't an order, it was something quieter, which was silence. Tim Richmond mattered because it showed what NASCAR could become. He was talented, he was different, and he brought personality to a sport that didn't always know how to handle it. And this story matters because it shows how institutions sometimes deal with discomfort, not by erasing history, but by simply not telling it. Tim Richmond wasn't forgotten because he wasn't great. He was forgotten because his story arrived before the sport and the culture were ready to understand it. Today we look back with clearer eyes, and when we do, Tim Richmond isn't just a tragic figure. He's a reminder that some of the most important stories in sports aren't the easiest ones, but the ones that challenge us to be better than we were before. Today we understand more, and because we understand more, stories like Tim Richmond's deserve to be told fully, not quietly set aside. If you want more deep dives into forgotten sports stories, uncomfortable truths, and history people stop talking about, consider subscribing. There are a lot of stories like this that deserve to be remembered.